Welcome back to the Mom and Mind podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. On this episode, I am talking with Alexa Ericson, and she is sharing her journey through pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. And during her process on deciding how she wanted to birth, she chose free birth for her second birth. She's going to talk with us about what that means and what that looked like for her, and also talk about how she found comfort in writing and writing poetry and putting that into a book in hopes to help other women. Her book, Motherhood, Disenchanted, ventures into the nitty-gritty, sleep-deprived, chaotic, and sometimes dark thoughts that come fluttering through the early years of mothering. And after back-to-back pregnancies and years of isolated mothering due to her location and then lockdowns, she felt a major gap in the discussion around the raw and tough, intimate moments of motherhood. She used her writing as a form of catharsis and way to work through all of those difficulties as they arose. Alexa delves into marriage, changes in her body, breastfeeding, anxiety, exhaustion, loss of self, and a whole lot more. She's on to share her story with us. So let's meet Alexa. Welcome, Alexa. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm grateful that you're going to share your story because I think there are a lot of parts of it that are good for people to hear, especially because there's certain types of birth that are thought of in certain ways, and there's a lot in here. So I'm happy for you to share, and yeah, please do start wherever you'd like with your story.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I know there's so many intricacies of birth and motherhood. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, we'll try and touch on all of it. I guess I'll start with kind of the birth of my first son. And let's see, he was born January 2019. So I was, pregnant before, like the year before that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and For him, I always knew I wouldn't birth in a hospital. It
Mm-hmm.
just made a lot of sense to me, and I I just really value being like listened to and respected, and I don't find that in any sort of a hospital setting or oftentimes even like a doctor's office.
Mm-hmm.
They just kind of like, this is the job we have to do. We're going to do whatever we want in order to get that to happen, and there's a lot of like coercion, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So I was kind of like had knowledge of that background. I had trained as a doula in 2017. I just always loved birth and children and wanted to be like working with them in any way I could. And so I learned what a doula was, and I thought, yeah, that sounds like the right avenue, and like how I might be able to get more into that field. So I thought I had some pretty good knowledge there of quote unquote natural birth, or it turns out there was like a lot more to learn. But
Mm-hmm.
which is funny because I don't know, doulas are kind of portrayed as like, I think more, but of course it depends on experience and training, but my training was, it was through Dona, and it was like a weekend intensive, and so really it's just like a couple days training, and then boom, there you are to like go into the field to essentially be a woman's almost advocate, except you kind of also can't
Right.
necessarily do
Right, right,
anything.
right.
It's sort of like, oh, maybe I can offer them education, but once you get into a hospital setting again, or just a setting with a medical provider, it doesn't always matter who's there.
Mm.
And so yeah, that's just interesting because sometimes people are like, I'm doing a hospital birth, but I hired a doula, and
Mhm.
having come out the other side, being a doula and even having a doula at my home birth, you know, I can say like, well, that doesn't necessarily, don't just like rely on a doula alone. That's a side note, but
No, that's interesting because there's another episode that just come out that talks a little bit about the complexities of the doula world and hospitals in particular.
yeah,
So, anyways, it's totally relevant, and also it's great to have support, and it's also hard to be a doula.
yes, yeah,
Yep.
I can agree with that.
Mhm.
So yeah, I just knew like, oh, well then the other option is home birth. Like that's kind of what I had learned. And so I immediately hired some midwives. I met with like two or three and settled on this one, which ended up being two midwives and working together. And one had been working for many years, um, and she had worked like uncertified as well. And then she did get her certification, like her license.
Mm,
I think just to like grow her clientele.
mhm,
And then the other one was younger and had just come out of midwifery school. So in my mind, I'm like, oh, cool, like, kind of the old wise ways and then like the new age, thing going on. Like this will be
mhm.
a combo. And so I had them booked at like, I don't know, 8 weeks or something because I had also learned just from like my doula days, there's only so many home birth midwives
Right,
available.
right.
Sometimes they only take one or two births, so you have to, like,
Mhm,
get early. Um, so I had that booked, and my I mean, I it's like hindsight, is where I'm coming from, but it
mhm,
was an interesting journey, and I learned a lot. Um, the meetings were So, like, the idea like, the pros where I was like, "Oh, the meetings are gonna be longer and more casual, and it's not like a doctor's office vibe. It's, like a couch, and it's kind of in, like, a yoga studio area type of thing," and, they do more informed consent where, "Okay, here's a paper on, GBS testing," or, um, you know, why we would check your urine for proteins, et cetera, and read this. And then next time we meet, you can decide if you want to do that or not. Um, so there were some things that in my young mind, I was like, oh, this is like good. Like this is more in line with what I wanted. Um, and it was interesting. My family was very like, oh my gosh, a home birth. Like, what if something happens? Like, what are you gonna do? And it was very kind of, like, annoying to feel like I had to educate them because I was like,
mm,
"Guys, I don't wanna like, this
mhm.
is birth, just get on board." Um, but something I would say is, like, the midwives can basically do everything except, like, a C-section or an epidural. Like,
Mhm,
and if an epidural is just pain relief, so, that would be, like, a choice if I felt like going in. Um, and a C-section would be like such an intense emergency, you call an ambulance or something, but it never dawned on me that what I was saying to them was, "I'm inviting the hospital into my house."
mm,
It's like that was part of my defense because they're comfortable with the hospital, so I'm trying to, like, relay to them, "No, guys, like, basically, they've got drugs if you're, oh, God forbid you're bleeding. They can do stitches, like, they're medical professionals."
mhm,
It just, like, never clicked with me with, like, if I wasn't comfortable with medical professionals in a hospital, like, why is it that different just to have them in another setting, which was just my house? So in hindsight, I'm like, "Oh, should have thought that through." Um,
So sorry if I can just
yeah,
like for folks who are listening, what you're saying is that at the time you thought it would be maybe more collaborative or more holistic or like some idea about a home birth being different than hospital birth, but your realization is that it was similar, but just in
yeah,
your home without like access to medical certain medical procedures.
yes, yeah. So in my mind, I felt like, oh, being in a hospital is unsafe, and being at home would be safer because like my reasons didn't hold up. So basically I did like think it was going to be more holistic or more, quote unquote natural, or safer from that idea of like, oh, I'll have more autonomy if I'm at home and I won't have autonomy over my body if I'm in a hospital. Like if I'm at home, um, I'll be able to say no, or there won't be so many interventions. Um, And that for me wasn't true. And I
Mm.
think for a lot of people isn't true because the term midwife, I mean, it's kind of become different now. And I know that term midwife has come out now as well. People are more familiar with it,
Oh,
which,
are you saying that like it used to be more holistic and it's becoming more medicalized?
yes, like now some people will say, oh, I have a midwife, but it's in the hospital. And
Sure.
a
Yeah, I've heard of
lot of
midwives in
times,
the hospital.
sure,
Yep.
and a lot of times they're nurse midwives. Those are
Mm-hmm.
usually the ones who could be in the hospital. So essentially
Mm-hmm.
it's just like a nicer name for an
Mm-hmm.
OB. Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, sure, maybe they're so it's almost like gaslighting, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Mm.
Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
That
And of course,
sucks.
this isn't, I can't say it's true for everybody,
Mm-hmm.
and more just like what I was realizing for myself. Um, and yeah, so I would go to these appointments and I felt like again in hindsight, like my intuition was speaking up where I was just kind of like, why am I here? Like I didn't really have much to talk about. I
Mm.
wasn't like worried about birth. I didn't feel like I needed these tests, but since they were there, okay, I'll do them. Um, but yeah, it's just when you have a medical professional there, you put all your trust in them, I
Uh-huh.
suppose.
Uh-huh.
You always look to them.
Yeah.
Um, so let's see, my birth comes around and it's like the stormiest day of the year.
Mm.
And my water had broke at like 11 p.m. the night before. And then I let the midwives know. And it's that funny moment where I'm like, sure, like, is that really my water breaking? Like, I know it
Mm.
is. Like,
Mm-hmm.
is this are we actually going to do this?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I didn't feel anything until maybe like 6 the next morning, like the tiniest of anythings. But at least I was like, oh, okay, so like it's gonna happen. Um, and it was a very chill day. I just hung out, like I cleaned and baked cookies, etc. And my husband and I were we were like playing cards or something, and then we were playing charades, and I was like bouncing on my birth ball. And then realized like I couldn't focus very much. And this was probably around like 4 p.m.
Okay,
So
so you've gone
it,
like a long time.
yeah, yeah. When I say yeah, like 6 p.m., I was like trying to feel if there's anything. And I was like, okay, I think that was something, so just like
Uh-huh.
very quickly,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah.
So that's when it was like, okay, I was just kind of ignoring them. I'm like, all right, when it gets intense, it'll get intense. So yeah, probably around 4:30, I'm like, oh wait, like it's kind of hard for me to focus on these cards.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, okay, I need a break from playing these games right now. And I had been texting my family and so around then I let the midwives know, like, okay, I think it's picking up, but you probably won't be hearing from me like when it's go time. And then it just I feel like just got intense fast. So I don't know, 10 minutes later, I was like, ran to the sink and threw up. And I told my husband, I'm like, call them back. Like,
Oh wow. Yeah, yeah. That's
I know, I
intense.
was like, oh my gosh, wait, like it's happening. But it was, yeah, the labor was, I mean, I was never like concerned about it in the sense that I actually had more of a fear of breastfeeding. Those were the horror stories I had heard.
Mm.
So I know some people kind of have people tell them horror stories of their labor or whatever, and they're like, "Oh my
It,
god, it might hurt."
yeah. I don't
But
know why that happens, but it's so common that people tell you some people tell you the worst things they've heard and yikes.
I think it's because it's somebody finally bringing up birth, and that
Mm-hmm.
person may have like nobody ever really asked him how it went,
Mm-hmm.
anything, and they have all this like trauma trapped inside them, and they just see an opportunity to like get it off their chest and to share. And I think it's something like that. Like it's almost like, oh, I gotta spill this because like it triggered my birth, and like now I'm thinking
Oh,
about it.
sure. Yeah,
Now,
I do agree with you there. For people who are sharing their personal experience, it's extra special when strangers share random stories.
Yes, exercise. I'm not saying it's necessarily right. I'm just saying, yeah, like why do people think like, "Oh, you're gonna give birth? Like, let me tell you about, this crazy
No, I agree with that,
stuff."
what you were saying. Yep.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, I don't know if that happens. But I had heard horror stories of breastfeeding. So I had gone to like a couple, pregnancy circles, etc.
Mhm.
All I heard was just how hard it was, bleeding nipples, like all these things. So
Right, right.
I was like never worried about birth. I was just like, oh my gosh, like what about breastfeeding after? Will I even know what
Mhm.
to do, etc. So like
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
was the fear I had to contend with. So labor, I just like walked back and forth pretty much the entire time. And we had a birth tub, and I remember really wanting to get in it, but the midwives were kind of like, oh, not yet, which, in hindsight kind of bothered me. But again, like I just really deferred my power to them because I had hired
Mm.
them, supposed to know what to do.
Mm.
What do I know, right?
Right.
Um, and finally they started filling it up. Or my husband and my midwives got there, I think around 6:30. And I had hired a doula. And so she got there maybe at 7 p.m. or something. Um, and that was interesting. The side note on the doula thing was I had hired a doula, and she seemed very cool and nice. And then she ended up leaving to do another opportunity, like in another state, when I was like 36 weeks pregnant. So I hired this other doula who I didn't really have time to like get to know as on like that deep of a level, but she seemed sweet. I didn't know
Mhm.
how it was going to be, what I was going to need, so
Right.
I want to have somebody just in case. Um, and that's another thing that will happen with doulas,
Mhm.
just they could just leave. And yeah, so the the storm was happening. We lived on a mountain during that time, and our water was shut off for a while as well because the power went out.
Mm.
And so like the pump to connect the water to the house also went out. But finally it turned back on. I was not worried about it because it happened a lot in the winter. And I was like, you know what? It's gonna come back on when I need it.
Okay.
And it did. It did. So I was able to have the tub, but of course the water heater could not keep up. Um,
Mm.
and so they're boiling pots of water, on the stove. Um and it felt so nice to be in the water. I wish it was hotter, but it felt really nice.
Mm.
Um, and it almost like felt like it slowed things down, or not it okay, it felt like less intense when I was in the water.
Mhm.
So it didn't slow things down, it just felt less intense.
Mhm.
And I was like, well, no, it has to be more intense for me to give birth, right? So I had this contraction, this surge that I could tell was like transition.
Mhm.
Uh, because they all felt the same. And then this one like lasted longer and this was more intense. So I called my husband back over, and um I was like, I want to get out because I was like, I can't just like be this comfortable giving birth. It was this weird story I had created for myself, where like, oh no, it's supposed to just get more intense and more, like it should be more painful almost, right? Like so it was an interesting story
Mhm.
I told myself. And so I get out, and I think I walked maybe a little bit more, but it felt kind of pushy, right after that, like right when I got out. And I remember being in the bathroom and holding on to the towel bar on the wall and having a huge surge, and just like kind of squatting down and the towel bar breaking off the
Oh. Oh
the
boy.
wall. And I
Mhm.
just like threw it aside and like turned around and leaned on the counter because I was still like mid, surge. And that was like really funny. Uh,
Mhm.
and I remember the younger midwife. Okay, so I remember saying like, I'm pushing. Is it okay that I'm pushing?
Mm.
Which again is just like a perfect example of like deferring power and just kind of like not not knowing, kind of like if somebody is there, I guess it's just and they're a medical provider, it's almost like you don't necessarily believe your body until they affirm it.
Right.
So like,
Especially if it's your first, you
and so
know,
that
yeah.
that's something that I think is hard and I kind of don't appreciate is like women are so capable and so powerful and definitely the ones who are going to know their body best, like who are going to know if they're ready to push or not or
Mm.
what they should be doing. And they will ignore that voice in lieu of a medical provider saying, oh no, you're not ready to push,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
well, yeah, just things like that. um, I was in the bathroom and I'm pushing, not fully pushing, it's kind of like my having a surge that ends in, like, pushing, like
Mhm.
grunting,
Mhm.
and so I asked them, "Is it okay that I'm pushing?" And let's see, what did they say? I can't remember what they said the first time because it happened again, and then I asked them again, like, "Is it okay? Is it okay?" And, um, maybe it was after the first time I asked, like, the newer midwife was like, "Well, do you want me to check you?" Which it's kind of frustrating that they asked me that because they knew I didn't want that.
Mhm.
Because checking, AKA like sticking your fingers up a woman's vagina to check for
Right.
dilation, really tells you nothing.
Right.
Because you could be very little dilated and 30 minutes later give birth. They can't actually tell you like how long things are gonna
Mhm.
happen or anything like that. So, yeah.
So, like, up until this point, like in your process and meeting with them and whatnot, did you uh, feel supported, or did you feel heard, or were your preferences listened to? Um,
Yeah, that's a great question. It felt like a little superfluous, like, it just felt like I didn't really need anything from them. Um, so I don't yeah, I
that's tough.
mean.
Yeah. I mean, if I've heard certainly stories of midwives who are not the kind of super in tune, intuitive type.
Mhm,
I mean, certainly there are people who are very in tune and, listen and let you lead and all of that. But
mhm,
this is like what you're describing, this like, I don't need, or you don't need anything from them.
mhm.
Is that what you said? I don't know
Yeah,
if I'm getting that right or not. You don't need anything from them. So like not feeling supported in some way.
yeah, I guess sometimes I had questions and I didn't feel like they were necessarily answered. It was
Mm,
almost like they were like, "Well, here's like a verbatim statement on GBS," or something like
mhm,
that. So it was kind of just like, "Oh, they're fine," but I was mostly just doing what I thought I was supposed to be doing. Like,
mhm,
I hired midwives because I have to hire midwives,
mm,
because that's who has to be at the birth. And I'm going to these prenatals because it sounded exciting and it sounded fun. The idea of kind of spending time thinking about my pregnancy would sound fun. And then I would get to them and I would just kind of be like, no, I don't know. Like,
mm.
um, yeah, it wasn't super, I don't know. I think it's just kind of like they were doing that appointment to do the appointment again because they had to. I was there because I had what I thought I had to be. Of course, you don't have to go to any prenatals if you don't want to. I mean, that's a farce, but no, I didn't know that. That's not often talked about. Um, so it was kind of just like a lot of twiddling my thumbs and yeah, yeah. And I also felt like um I I wasn't told a lot of options in terms of like I don't think we ever really talked about lotus birth or cord burning. It was always just like, oh, and we can do delayed cord clamping. But that was like the only thing in terms of birthing the placenta, which, if people don't know what that is, a lotus birth is where you leave the placenta attached. Sometimes you put some drying herbs or salts on it and you wrap it up and you keep that attached to baby until it naturally dries out. The cord does and detaches itself, which can take a couple days. Cord burning is where you use oftentimes beeswax candles to basically like cauterize the cord instead of cut it. And that could take like 10-ish minutes, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. That's what we did for my second birth. It's very beautiful. And delayed cord clamping is where ideally you wait for the cord to be empty of blood, not pulsing, totally white. And then you would cut that cord um, so that all the blood from the placenta and like in the cord is going back to baby. And they have all of their blood volume right before you would sever that. So I like those are all things I learned after my first birth.
Mm,
Um, and yeah, so I guess it really was more just like, do you have questions about this test? Do you want to do this
mhm,
test?
mhm,
Which again, they're just doing their job and that's totally fine. So I'm not sure if I felt like held in kind of like a wise woman, sisterly kind of way or
mm,
anything.
mhm,
But certainly they were there if I had any questions. Um, so it was kind of like the standard prenatal care, but longer appointments. Yeah. And maybe
mhm,
that was just like my relationship with them. I'm not sure. But I think it also just had a lot to do with like me not really having many fears to talk through. Um, I think that, yeah, that's a good time for women to like explore the horror story that their mom passed on to them or
mm,
um,
mhm,
bring up any sort of like, but if I bleed, then what happens?
mhm,
I just
mhm.
didn't have a lot of that.
So then, coming back to the birth itself, what
Mhm. Yeah. So when the newer midwife said, "You want me to check you?" I didn't answer actually because it was really interesting. Like I didn't want that, but because she said that, my brain was like, if you say yes, then she'll at least go away. And I thought that was really interesting that my brain said that because I could relate to like being in that very vulnerable state. I think sometimes I heard birth stories where a woman was like, "Well, I didn't want an epidural," but they kept asking me or
mm,
something.
mm,
And in my mind, I'd be like, "Huh, well, like, why don't you keep saying no?" or something because I had never gone through birth before. And being in it and being in that like very primal birth state, like birth brain, somebody's asking you a question, you're just like, "How do I end this quickest?" And so it was really
mm,
interesting that and so my brain said that, and I was like, "You don't want that, so, like, just don't answer." My husband's like, "Did you hear them?" And I was like, "I heard them," but I just, like, didn't say anything. Um, and so then I was pushing again and, "Oh, can I push?" And then the younger midwife said, "Well, if you wanna get on the bed, sometimes side laying can help, like, the last lip of the cervix melt away," or something like, oh, she made it sound so nice. Um, which in hindsight was just another way for me to get on the bed so they can like see better because I was upright in the bathroom where like they couldn't really fit in the bathroom. So I go to the bed. Um, Long story short, after I don't know, felt like 5 minutes of pushing, but I know it was longer. My son was born and he was great. And it was, yeah, such a beautiful moment. And we didn't know the gender, like the sex of the
mm,
baby. So
mhm,
we found it was a boy, and that was like such a special moment. And uh, the kind of medicalized part for me and what caused a lot of anxiety and trauma for me came after that part. So he's born, he's on my chest, everything's good. And but right away, he's on my chest, and the younger midwife, you can tell, like just looking back, like goes just right into like, oh, let me do all my training, let me do everything I learned,
I
and like
see.
has her gloved hand on my baby and is like rubbing my baby. Where like when he first came up, like I'm trying to put my hand on him and
Mhm,
I can't because her hand's in the way. And
mhm,
like that's a part that really sticks with me. It's these little things
mhm,
right
mhm,
after birth that like it just is really hard. So I'm like trying to rub him, and she's like, "Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead, do your thing." And I'm just like, "Okay, like thanks for letting me touch my baby." Uh, and they're like, "Oh, do you want to do the breast crawl?" And I'm like, "I don't know. Like, what is that really?" Like, I had kind of heard of it, but I'm like, "I don't know. Like, how long does that take? Like, do I? I don't know." Um, because I told you the breastfeeding thing I was like
Mhm.
a little concerned about, but he latched right away. And our breastfeeding journey, thankfully, like just totally fine. And I was so thankful because, yeah, all those horror stories. So everything was good there. But he's latched, and the younger midwife, was like, "Oh, I need to assess you." Let me see. No, we had to do the placenta birth first, I think. So I didn't I didn't know that licensed midwives have to follow essentially the same rules that, an OB would have to follow, or a midwife in a hospital would have to follow, the regulations of the state. So, for example, your placenta has to come in the state of California, where I was at the time, like within an hour. So after, I don't know, half an hour or so, um, they start kind of prompting me and being like, okay, like we should get the placenta out. And I didn't feel any contractions or anything. And they're like, okay, we'll just like get on your knees, try pushing, like try coughing, okay, like harder than that. And wasn't coming out. They're like, well, you haven't peed in a long time. That's probably why. Why don't you go try peeing? I couldn't pee. Tried like peppermint oil in the essential oil in the toilet. Like, oh, that's supposed to help. Whatever. It was not happening. Um, and so she had already, right after birth, she had already assessed me for tears, which again, I just did not know all of this was optional. And keep in mind, I had gone through doula training and I had
Mhm.
even, been to births. Um, and I had a doula
Mhm.
at my birth,
Mhm.
which I didn't really need. And so even so, I did not even, it did not cross my mind to be like, no, thanks. Or, oh, if I tear, it'll heal on my own. Or I don't feel like peeing right now. Just like none of that
Mhm.
crossed my mind. And so she had assessed me for tears. It was so incredibly painful. It
Mm.
was so painful because I was just so raw. Obviously, I had just given birth. And so she's got her hands all, up around. It was so painful. Um, and then the placenta, they're trying to do that. And she says, well, how about I just kind of follow my hand up the cord and see if maybe it's just kind of sitting in there, AKA put her like hand up my vagina. And that was the first time I was like, no. Like,
Mhm.
finally, I was
Mhm.
like, I
That does not
cannot
sound.
have
Yeah.
another hand on my vagina because I was so ready to be done because it hurt so bad. And the other midwife says, well, then we can do a shot of Pitocin. And I said, yep, sounds good. Anything but because those were my two options. There was no, well, okay, we'll just wait and see, or sounds good. It was like either she can put her arm inside your body that just gave birth, or you can have a shot of this drug. And the shot of the drug sounded way better to me.
Mhm.
And they did not say, okay, well, let me just tell you the risks. Let me just tell you the side effects of this shot. No,
Mhm.
they just gave me this shot. So immediately I had these contractions, placenta came out. That's the other thing that happened because it's coming back to me now. After she assessed me for tears and we're trying to get the placenta out, and I couldn't pee, they cathetered me. They
Mm.
didn't ask, they just said, this is what we're doing. Drained all the pee, whatever. So I was so raw from all of that touching.
Mhm.
Um, so get the shot of Pitocin, and then you think, oh, okay,
So
finally.
this is none of this was discussed beforehand. You at any point you weren't given so like these are the potentials, these are some scenarios. Not that every provider in every setting can go over every eventuality, but it doesn't sound like at any point you got information to make an informed decision.
No, no, there was no informed consent. And also, like, keep in mind there was no emergency. So there's plenty of time to just
Right.
say, do you have any questions about that? Are you
Right.
sure you'd like to do that? Would you like to know the risks versus benefits? Would you like to wait? Would just none of that. Um, and okay, so get the Pitocin, etc. And I'm like, okay, can I just snuggle my baby now in my head, But no, because in California, it was also quote unquote required to do a newborn screening test, which is where they prick your baby's heel and squeeze it to get blood and fill this little paper. And it took so long, so much squeezing, multiple pricks. My baby was screaming. And this was right after I had gotten the Pitocin, and I felt an emotional shift where I just turned off because I was getting I was about to have, like, a panic attack from that,
Yeah,
like
I mean, probably so overstimulated at
Yes.
that point.
Yeah, I was getting hot, I could feel, like, my breathing kind of shallowing and
Mm,
stuff,
mm.
and I thought, "I can't break down, like, I can't lose it in front of these people." And so I just, like, disassociated, and that was the start of, like, my very difficult kind of intro to motherhood. I think something that's not discussed is that Pitocin has a very, very high correlation with postpartum depression and anxiety.
Mm.
Um, like, in my mind, this is not science. In my mind, it's like almost a guarantee you're gonna get it if you get Pitocin. But as far as actual, facts, I'd
Incidents.
have to check, but it is like 90% or something. It's out there. You can Google it.
Okay, yeah, I'll look
So,
that up and add
yeah.
a resource in.
Yeah, and the resource. I think I even have it linked, in my poetry book, which we'll get to because it was just very in a very intense time, and there was so much, like, dark mixed in with the light,
Mm,
like, here I was, like, very excited to have my baby, so excited to take care of him, and just, like, the anxiety, that I got from Pitocin and also just from these midwives kind of, like, indicating, like, "You don't know what you're doing." Like, "Welcome to motherhood. You don't have a say, and let us tell you, what you should be doing,"
it
etcetera.
doesn't sound very trauma informed, like a trauma
Mhm,
informed approach that these particular
mhm.
providers had.
Yeah, yeah, and even meeting afterwards with them, they do a couple meetings afterwards, like, I think it's 24 hours or 48 hours and whatever, and I remember feeling so lost
Hmm.
and feeling, like, sad and upset and
Mm.
them having really no suggestions or resources or anything to say. So I ended up turning to writing. Like, I'm a writer, I'm a poet. I've just done that as long as I can remember as a way to kind of uncover what I'm feeling,
Hmm.
thinking, or just kind of like letting emotions out. And so that was, thank gosh I had that lifeline. We were also very isolated because we were up on the mountaintop.
Mm.
And so I would just be, like nursing my baby in the middle of the night in his room crying and just writing down, like not understanding why I felt that way and
Hmm.
like, why it felt so hard. And social media was like, this was 2019. It was finally like very prevalent, but still kind of like only certain messaging was getting through. And the messaging that I was getting, like what I mean by that is like, I feel nowadays there's kind of more holistic people, using social media, but at that time, I it didn't really seem like there
Mm.
was.
Hmm.
Um, and the messaging I was getting was like, "Your baby should be sleeping this amount of time," like, "Motherhood should be great,"
Yeah,
just etcetera.
all that stuff.
All that stuff.
Like not including in all of that messaging, it doesn't include it's like in a vacuum.
Yeah.
It doesn't include that. I mean, from what you're describing, and you had a traumatizing situation after birth
Mhm.
that and I don't know if at that time you clocked it as like a traumatizing thing. You're just feeling it.
Yeah.
You're feeling the feelings and not understanding why you feel this. And then social media is telling you you're supposed to just feel awesome. And
Yeah.
mm,
Yeah, and if your baby doesn't sleep that much, like, I I I was so worried that I was, like, damaging my baby, and so I started writing, and, a couple times I shared on my social media these kind of raw things, and I had such incredible feedback. Like, women would message me and be like, "Thank you. Thank you
that's
for sharing this. I needed to hear this." Like,
mm,
they were crying all day yesterday, and I feel like a horrible mom, and I just
mm,
don't know what's happening, or even, about their births, and it it was so beautiful, and so I ended up so I right then and there, I was like, "I'm gonna write a book, like, I'm going to publish these poems, like, women need to know it's not all, like, rainbows and sunshines, and that doesn't make you, like, a bad mom."
Mhm.
Um, and also just the, like, the companionship, I guess you could say, of other women going through the same thing was so helpful, and that's also the messaging I was getting was like,
Sure, yeah.
it's not like, "Oh, here, let me fix it for you." It's just like, "Thank you for thank you. Thank you for just, like, saying, 'Ah, this sucks
Mhm.
today.'"
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, so I finally published that poetry book, this past July, so July 2023. Um,
Fantastic.
thank you. Yeah, I wrote most of it then, but I my kids are a year apart, so
Mm.
I actually got pregnant again around I think it was almost 5 months postpartum.
Mhm.
So I, was kinda sick and all that, and so I paused the book.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but I'm so glad I did because for my second birth, I ended up doing a free birth, which is no medical professionals present, like, including a doula or anything. It was just me and my husband and my yeah, he had just turned 1, my son, and they were actually in the other room when I, like, actually gave birth to, which was so funny. But, and that all happened because through my writing, I was able to process, this trauma
Mm.
and trust my intuition more, learn more about myself.
Mhm.
And then also just through research, I used the Freebirth Society as a pretty good resource for just digging more into birth, like the industrial obstetric model and
Mhm.
a lot of the gaslighting, etc. And um, like through that and women I met, etc., just helped me realize how how powerful women really are and
Mm.
how like pathologized birth is in the medical system and how it doesn't need to be that way.
Mhm.
My second birth was, I mean, it was so healing and really helped a lot of that trauma. Just not having anybody in my space that I didn't want there who was poking or prodding or making me question myself. And it was so peaceful and just, I mean, just like regular, just like normal, just birth. Like it was just,
It
yeah,
sounds like there was some sort of inklings that you were talking about in the first birth, where like you didn't have the kind of fears, you didn't have the questions, you didn't. Um, uh, I don't know if you said this specifically, like need from the midwives them to answer, a bunch of questions and stuff like that. That that information from that time helped
mhm.
inform your decision and your approach the second time.
Yeah, yeah. And there's no
Mm,
rules or regulations. So that felt right, and I also, didn't do, like, prenatal care, in the sense of going into a doctor's office. Of course, I cared for myself, prenatally and took, supplements I thought felt good, and things like that, but there was no, like, "Oh, are you sure you don't wanna do this test? Like, do you wanna kill your baby?" Like, that kind of manipulation from any sort of medical providers. Um, and so it was really wonderful to even be able to include that in my book to kind of the bookend of that positive birth story as well.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And um, so this was after my first birth. This is poem 3 in my book. Gentle voices expand the room. 6 weeks since my blood, your body, and our souls intertwined. The tears of anxiety and despair refuse to stay silent. My throat closes quickly. I stand defeated, handing the reason for my cracking composure to my husband. Quickly, I shuffle to the bathroom, determined to cry alone. I begin to count round objects, my breathing leveling with each one: toilet paper, cup, soap, doorknob. There aren't enough round objects in the world. So that's kind of taking you to like that feeling of of kind of just being a new mom and feeling a bit lost and not really understanding
Mhm.
what it's about. I mean, of course, there's so many hormones, um, but just feeling like, oh, 6 weeks after birth, like I should have it by now. I should be like good
Mm.
and okay. And in reality, my first son was not a sleeper.
Mhm.
And I just was sleep deprived and was
Sure.
not nourishing myself and was just like, I don't know what I'm doing. Shouldn't I know what I'm doing? Um, Let me see. Okay, I'll end with this one. This one is more about like my relationship to that postpartum body, and back to back pregnancies and um, yeah, getting to know myself again. I have little white slivers where my skin is stretched to let the sunlight through. The entire time growing you, my uterus could not contain the joy, the gratefulness, the other world your spirit was pouring in from. I look down to those slivers that pucker near my hip, and it reminds me I have done more than anyone could think possible. Why did my mind rush back to worthlessness the minute you were born? Why do I live in a world that pushes aimless productivity while I bleed, cramp, cry, leak, and feed two humans at once? Why does the world not see the most important job is the one they refuse to acknowledge? Parenthood and stretch marks.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing both of those. It really gets to that really deep emotional undercurrent of, what you were dealing with. And I appreciate you sharing your story and what you went through and people who are hearing your story and are resonating with you, to be able to know that somebody else had a similar experience is really powerful. So
Yeah.
thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And I just hope, the women listening to this know how strong they are. And if they're in that moment of feeling not strong, try writing about it, try getting those thoughts out, even if they're not pretty. And,
Hmm.
just it can help to put these things on paper so they're not just like sitting in our brain over and over again, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
Thank you
thank
so much.
Yeah.
You can find more from Alexa on her website, mamafreebirth.com, and on Instagram, mamafreebirth. And I'd like to put a reminder out there to all of you who are already subscribers. Make sure you go to the app that you listen to this podcast on. Make sure that you're still getting the podcast downloaded directly to you. For some people, those have stopped, and I want to make sure that you're getting all of these episodes delivered to you as soon as they come out. And if you're new to this podcast, please do go subscribe and get all of the episodes of Mom and Mind downloaded directly to you. There is a huge catalog of episodes for you to look through and find ones that resonate for you. I'm so grateful that you are here listening and you continue to listen to this podcast, as hearing stories and sharing stories is so important in this new parenting process. And it also helps support this podcast to keep going. Thank you so much for being here. Until next time.